Greetings and welcome to another episode of Fidemo, where we discuss ideas of democracy. Today we are joined by Professor Alf Nilsen, who is a professor of sociology and a director at the Center for Asian Studies in Africa at the University of Pretoria. Prof, welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
As a way to come in, I think... Of course, we just had a discussion offline about this, but there's a way to come in. I think the idea of democracy, it's almost taken as a given that there is a consensus in understandings of democracy, its implications and all of that. I think in our last episode, one of the contributors argued that, well, we haven't really defined democracy for ourselves. We haven't defined democracy for the present. So we still need to define democracy, particularly from the global south. How do you intervene to this? How do you define democracy?
Well, I'll start by saying something about how I don't define it. And there's no sort of disciplinary offense intended here, but I don't define it in the way that it's very often defined within the confines of mainstream political science, whereby the focus tends to be very minimalist, very often very formal. The focus is upon institutions and procedures, specifically elections, but also the workings of the institutions that are typically defined as belonging to the state proper. That to me is a very limited view because it leaves out what you might call the social origins of democracy and the way in which democracy is fundamentally about how power structures the workings of social relations, social structures. So to me, and perhaps this reflects my training in the field of sociology, I'm very much concerned with understanding democracy in broader social terms as the changing of balances of power in society in such a way as to transfer power away from small dominant groups, what we very often call elites, limiting their capacity to determine the way in which society develops, its trajectory of development, and transferring a substantial amount of that power to other groups that we can refer to as subaltern, that is, as being exploited and oppressed, and enhancing their capacity to exercise agency in terms of giving shape to patterns of distribution in society, forms of recognition, representation, and determining the shape of society and its development over a longer term basis. And I think when we look at democracy's history at a macro level across its longue durée, that's what we're looking at. We're looking at tectonic shifts in the social that manifests in a redistribution of political power and opening up of spaces of decision-making at various levels. And ultimately what this tells us is that we need to think about democracy and what it is and its meanings more expansively. And with that comes, I think, a compulsion to also think about what the political is and what politics is far more expansively beyond, the realm of parliamentary politics, beyond the realm of sort of official diplomacy and official state-defined international relations and so on and so forth, and to incorporate a much broader sphere of actors, a much broader scope of different kinds of institutions, including social movements, for example, and recognizing that democracy and what it means and what it is cannot be fixed in time. It's very much shaped by the sort of the restructurings of power that these actors drive. And when we do that, that's when we really bring ourselves into a position where we can capture the radically emancipatory potential that democracy has, when it's much more than simply the institutions, the formal processes, the state proper.
I like the idea of the emancipatory element of it, and particularly in how the recent elections in both India and South Africa have been said to have kind of like brought these tectonic shifts that you mentioned. But I want to go back maybe before I get to the question of the elections, to maybe do a comparison between both these two countries, because I think they've both been the darlings of the empire, you know, for different reasons in terms of how they've related into the empire. And they've both, in a very interesting way, have had kind of like converging post-colonial trajectories in terms of nation state. How has democracy fared up in these two countries, and how has it evolved over the decades?
Well, it's a good question. It's a good comparison. I mean, and the links, in a sense, between South Africa and India is not just about being the darlings of empire, if you will, but it's also about the very close links that were forged in terms of the political imaginaries and very concrete connections that animated freedom struggles in both places, right? And that gives us a good starting point, I think, to begin with, recognizing that with both India and South Africa, we're talking about post-colonial southern democracies. And that comes with a number of meanings and a number of dimensions, all of which are consequential for understanding the present moment. It means, of course, that they are democracies that are shaped by imperial and colonial lineages, among other things. That's not the only, those are not the only lineages or factors shaping them. That they currently inhabit a very interesting position in the world system, a world system which is shaped by deep north-south inequality still, but also very consequential geopolitical transformations. That are perhaps, some of the more that throw up some of the most urgent issues that the world is grappling with in different ways at the present. But let's leave that aside just for one moment and start with what it means to be a post-colonial democracy. And that, of course, means to be a democracy that has been won through large-scale popular struggles. Large-scale popular struggles to overthrow colonial rule in different forms. I'm speaking here of colonial rule very broadly, to also incorporate, of course, apartheid in the South African context. And these victories were won at different points in time, in the middle of the 20th century and at the very end of the 20th century, which also gives you sort of different geopolitical moments in which these democracies were born, which have been consequential for their trajectory, another thing which we can come back to. But then comes, the slight twist in the tale, which is that even though these are democracies that were born out of large-scale, militant, very often radical forms of popular struggle to bring about freedom, to bring about emancipation, they are nevertheless democracies with very significant constraints. So if we turn to India first, it's very common to speak about India as a conservative democracy, which means that when India emerged as an independent nation state, as the largest democracy in the world, which it was very often referred to, numerically in terms of population and so on and so forth, it nevertheless remains the case that the governing elites of the country were partly unable to and partly unwilling to implement the kind of radical structural reform that would be needed in order to bring about a greater level of social equality in the Indian society. I think it's very telling that, in 1948, I think it was, as India was still shaping its constitution, the main architect of that constitution, B.R. Ambedkar, who was a lawyer, but also a Dalit. That is, he emerged out of India's previously untouchable castes, from the lowest rungs of India's caste hierarchy, if you will, spoke to the Constituent Assembly and said that India began its democratic life as a life of contradictions. That was his phrase. And he said, we will have in political life equality, but in social and economic life, we will have inequality. And that's what I'm getting at here, that even though a democratic nation state was born in 1947, brought into being as a result of immense popular struggle, even though India began its trajectory as a democracy with full enfranchisement, right? It nevertheless failed to push the kind of reforms along both class lines and caste lines, and, if you will, gender lines that could have created a more equal society, thereby realizing democracy's full potential. And those things are still with India to this day. In the early 21st century, one of the most defining features, not the only defining feature, but one of the most defining features of Indian society is how vastly unequal it has become. And it's giving South Africa some competition in terms of inequality. Which is not something to celebrate. The differences between the wealth and the income commanded by the top 10% of the population and that commanded by the top 50% is quite perverse. And when you then see how that overlaps with caste structures, there's recent data out just 2 weeks ago that reinforces this, to see how socioeconomic hierarchies are also caste hierarchies, meaning that upper caste groups basically control the vast amounts of wealth and income in Indian society, and lower caste groups predominate among those who constitute the poorest 50%. It's obvious that, the constraints upon Indian democracy have been durable. And this takes me back to my understanding of democracy as an emancipatory process. That can be more or less realized. And I think in the Indian case, it has been less realized than what it could have been. And that's a parallel, of course, to South Africa. South Africa emerges 30 years ago into full democracy, right? The transition is immense. The achievement is immense. Going from being considered less than human for the majority of the population to being a full human being with all civil and political rights, and with a constitution that guarantees a very substantial array also of social rights. That is not something to be taken lightly. But as you know, and as I know, as we all know, there are deep structures in this society created by the settler colonial heritage and what you might call the intensification of the settler colonial heritage through decades of apartheid rule that have not only remained intact, but have effectively deepened. And I'm talking again here of social and economic inequality, right? That if we look at distribution, South Africa is the most unequal society in the world. It has become vastly more unequal since the 90s. The statistics vary a little bit, but the one that I throw at my students normally when I do Sociology 101 is that if we look at South Africa's poverty stats, right? If you look at national numbers, some 55.5% of the population lives below the country's upper bound poverty line. And that's not a very generous poverty line. That's somewhere around 1,700 and 1,900 rands a month. And we all know what the racial makeup is of that 55%, right? It's a racialized structure of inequality that has remained entrenched and embedded in South African society. And in that way, one could argue that just as democracy in India has been limited in some significant respects in terms of its emancipatory impact on society, the same is the case with South Africa. So that's another sort of aspect of these being post-colonial governments. But there's more than that. It's also the fact that they are, both South Africa and India are democracies that are governed by parties that used to be the spearhead of liberation movements, or were at different points in time. And this is hugely consequential. And it's very typical of what it means to be post-colonial, right? So you have in both contexts large-scale liberation movements where there are different organizations, right? But there are two organizations that are the spearhead. In the Indian context, the Indian National Congress, of course, in the South African context, the ANC. The ANC even, supposedly derives its name from the Indian National Congress and all the rest of it. There's this typical dynamic, which is not exclusive to India and South Africa, but typical of post-colonial states, where the freedom movement that spearheads the struggle for liberation and spearheads the achievement of liberation becomes the governing party, and the state-carrying party becomes almost the state in certain ways in the post-colonial context. This is true in both South Africa and in India to varying degrees. And then begins this period of post-colonial hegemony, where the liberation movement, partly because of the legitimacy that it has built up, as the spearhead of the liberation struggle, as the leader of that great big battle that won freedom, and partly because of the organizational infrastructures that they have established through that struggle, are able to completely saturate the political field and lead with substantial amounts of consent from wide layers of the population, right? We saw that in election after election after election in South Africa, from the 90s onwards, with enormous majorities for the ANC until the present. Yep. In India, we saw the same through the 50s into the 60s. But then something started to change. Yeah. About 3 decades in, and it's the 3-decade rule. About 3 decades in, post-colonial hegemonies begin to erode. So India started this process in the 1970s. There was, greater political instability in the country. The Congress organizational infrastructure started to dwindle. And there was a turn towards authoritarianism. Democracy was suspended for 2 years, from 1975 to 1977, when this was the emergency period. When the emergency was lifted, lo and behold, the first coalition government in the country's history comes into being, the Janata Party government. And that sets India on, an almost 2 decades long process of the Congress party, losing more and more and more of its organizational heft, of its political hegemony, of, losing more and more of its ability to saturate the political space, and a long period of coalition governments and coalition rule. And of course, we see much the same thing right now, and this is about a temporal lag. It's about when freedom was achieved, when democracy was achieved in South Africa. The ANC has just lost its majority for the first time in 30 years. And the thing is that this was something to expect. If we step out of, with all due respect, the tendency towards South African exceptionalism in much thinking around politics in this country, and consider South Africa instead a post-colonial southern democracy, which one can compare across regional axes. One can compare across the African continent, but you can also compare very well with Asian examples and with Latin American examples. It wasn't really to be expected that this hegemony would last for much longer, especially not, of course, given the limitations upon democracy's emancipatory impact here, which is evident in all of those, what we call policy failures that have caused widespread disillusionment. And what happens when that hegemony starts to erode, when the saturation of the political space starts to contract, is that it creates opening for other political actors who are pursuing other political projects, wanting other directions in terms of society's development, wanting society to take a different form. And what's really important to be aware of there is, of course, that those actors are not necessarily always benevolent. Their visions, their projects are not necessarily always progressive. If we look at what came out of that long sort of interregnum period in India, it's actually a right-wing, reactionary and majoritarian and also deeply authoritarian political project that has taken hold still after the elections now, and I know we'll come to those later. And in the South African context, of course, we have seen the emergence of this sort of whole plethora, I tend to refer to it as an ecosystem, of authoritarian populist parties that combine a very sort of strong law and order rhetoric with a very strong xenophobic rhetoric to define the South African nation in very different ways from the Rainbow Nation rhetoric of the original ANC project, where South Africa belonged to everyone who lives in it. And instead saying that, no, what's the defining feature of belonging in South Africa is being, by virtue of your nationality, South African, and also being law-abiding, and these are, just, so what I've tried to outline here, what for me, being someone who specializes in the study of Indian politics, but doing it in the context of South Africa and observing South Africa at the same time as I study Indian politics. These for me are some of the sort of, at the national scale, defining features of what it means to be a post-colonial southern democracy. And of course, there's a whole other geopolitical layer there. But yeah.
Oh, that was encyclopedic. But I just want to go maybe because I think you've answered partly what was going to be my follow-up question on the elections that happened recently for both these two countries. But I guess I would still want to pose it, especially on the departing from the 3 decades rule and how of course the idea of the tectonic shift suggesting how both the parties who had been the custodians of democracies in both these countries have lost majority.
Yes.
And this majority was built on consent, on race consent. And consent that and race, interestingly, becomes constitutive of and kind of like very included in who becomes in and out. Whether it's could translate to meanings of religious culture and all of that, but this becomes that. But both these two parties lost their majority. We're looking at the government of national unity here, coalitions in India. What do these mean for democracy?
Well, I think it's important that we, when we look at the loss of majority for the governing parties in India and South Africa, we need to differentiate them in one basic respect first, which is that what happened in India is that the party that has emerged out of the long what I call the post-Congress interregnum, that long period of, some would call it instability, some would simply call it political change that followed after the Congress lost its hegemony. That party managed to consolidate, massive parliamentary majorities for a decade from 2014 when it first won a parliamentary majority. We're talking about the BJP under the leadership of Narendra Modi, of course, and again in 2019 when it's further increased its majority. So here we're talking about, the party that emerged out of that post-colonial interregnum, the post-Congress interregnum, has suffered an electoral setback. That's what we're talking about there. In the South African context, we're talking about something else. We're talking about the loss of hegemony by the former liberation movement that became the governing party. So this is, in a sense, the ANC is experiencing now what the Indian National Congress experienced, from the middle of the 1970s through the 1980s into the 1990s and so on. And these are processes, importantly, to be aware of, that has... there are fluxes and flows. All of a sudden, a certain party will take a hit. There'll be a step backwards. This process of change will appear to be reversed. As academics, we will emerge with op-eds saying the rise of something, or the fall of something, or the end of something, or the beginning of something. Very often revealing that we don't have the patience to sit back and look at the more sort of longer term dynamics of these processes. So my point here is just that, the two electoral outcomes are slightly different. What we saw in India, just to take them case by case, is a setback of, some 60 plus seats in parliament for Modi and the BJP. After, like I said, two resounding landslide electoral victories in 2014 and 2019. It's quite interesting to look at some of the details around that electoral setback. The vote share of the party has declined very little. So it's quite substantial loss of seats. It's one of those, typical outcomes that you get in a first past the post system. And a lot of the losses of seats came from one particular state, Uttar Pradesh in North India, which is very important. It's India's largest state. It's, a bigger state than most countries on the African continent, for example. It sends the most representatives to India's parliament. So that was and it's been a stronghold of the BJP. So it was significant that they lost there. And what most people chalk it up to, is the fact that Modi's failed economic policies are beginning to catch up with him. Modi has extended this promise that to the Indian nation and to the poor that he will bring development. and that India is on a path of progress, and he will bring everyone onto that path. In 2014, his slogan was basically development for everyone, and he was the man to bring it. And what a lot of commentators are pointing out is the fact that, although there has been substantial growth rates to a certain extent, especially after the COVID pandemic, it hasn't translated into jobs and employment. It doesn't keep pace at all in terms of wages and salaries among those who have employment. Salaries are stagnant. So inflation takes a real bite. And then there is the staggering increase in inequality. And that begins to erode, that promise of inclusion and prosperity. And as a result, the BJP now has to govern in a coalition. And I think it's much too early to state with any certainty what that coalition will entail. Yeah. There are a lot of people who say that it might impose constraints upon the party's ability to pursue its original political project, which combines neoliberalism with religious majoritarianism, Hindu nationalism. That it will constrain that. I think that remains to be seen. In the South African context, of course, we see something that, it's the erosion of post-colonial hegemony. I think it's, and it's a very significant turning point. I think we're now irreversibly at a point where we're going to be looking at, coalition governments for some time to come. Yeah. As, the political field, if you will, here in South Africa changes its form, as other political actors start to consolidate constituencies. And that will happen in very small and incremental ways. Yeah. The current governing party in India had, I think, 1 or 2 representatives in the first election that it contested way back in the early 80s. And look at them now, right? Yeah. So this starts in very small ways, but it's never insignificant. And I think what we've seen in South Africa with these elections is, you have one of the sort of the authoritarian populist parties that I talked about, Patriotic Alliance, being, if we are to interpret media messaging correctly these days, but there's a lot of contradictory stuff going around, going to be part of the government of national unity. Yeah. That's quite significant. This is an authoritarian right-wing political party, and it's not the only one. Yeah. So for me, what they're achieving, I think to a certain extent, and maybe even to quite a substantial extent, is something that similar parties have done in Europe. Which is, even when they don't win electoral victories, they shift the terms of political discourse. Yeah. I think we saw that in South Africa when Cyril presented the white paper on immigration earlier this year. Yeah. That white paper is a very strict one, if we are to put it politely, right? And that is how, let's call it a centrist party, or a left-of-center party, if you want to call it that, will tend to respond to pressure from far-right parties that are eating into their vote base. Yeah. Whether that is around, race, as it's happening very clearly in Europe, or whether it is in South Africa around nationality. And I use that term very deliberately because it's actually nationality here more than race, right? Because because the xenophobia is predominantly also Afrophobia. Yeah.
I think it's so interesting that you're touching on the Patriotic Alliance, because the themes that were building up, I think same in India also, with Hindu nationalism, and of course the response to that being the calls for the particular minorities to have their own homelands. What as a response to this nationalism. And you saw these populist nationalisms here in South Africa also emerging, and the Patriotic Alliance became one of the leaders in that. And even though they didn't get like a significant part in parliament, but they shifted the discourse, and they shifted what becomes part of the election campaign. I'm wondering if you can speak to this also. What do you think has been behind the rise of these themes, and this whole recreation of minorities.
Yeah, sure.
What has been the
Well, I think what we're seeing, not just in India and South Africa, but across large chunks of the global South, is the rise of something that I call Southern authoritarian populism. Now, I borrow my work, the key term there, authoritarian populism, from the British cultural theorist Stuart Hall, in part to get away from some of the more sort of unproductive and quite boring sort of interpretations of populism that prevail in, again, mainstream political science, but also because Hall, in his work, talked about something very specific, which was the ideology espoused by the Conservative Party in Britain as Margaret Thatcher emerged at its helm in the context of a deep economic and therefore also political crisis in the country, the end of the post-war order with Keynesian capitalism, with the state as a major actor, and with the welfare state as a major concession won by worker struggles in the first half of the 20th century and all of that. That order starts to collapse. The consensus around it, and that consensus cut very much across the right-left divide, actually, in British politics, and this was the case for Europe more generally. As the economic crisis deepens, that consensus falls apart. Margaret Thatcher emerges at the helm of a new Conservative Party that operates with an ideology that Hall refers to as authoritarian populism, which is basically a populism that says that there is a good, authentic British people, right, who must be defended against their other, who's threatening them. And that was a way of shoring up legitimacy and consent among vast layers of the British people for Conservative Party politics and for Margaret Thatcher's premiership. And the way it was done was, of course, in very racialized terms. The good, authentic British people was a white people.
Yep.
And the enemy outside threatening them was overwhelmingly immigrant communities, people of color. The savages, basically, and then you throw into that trade unionists and dissenters and sort of, left-wing activists and the rest of it, and then you have your other, which and you then have the grounds for justifying various authoritarian turns in the polity. So that's the origins of the concept. And when I look at the global South right now, I see cases like Erdogan's Turkey. I see someone like Bolsonaro, who served one term as president in Brazil, displacing, of course, Lula and the Workers' Party and Dilma Rousseff and the Workers' Party. I see someone like Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. I see someone like Modi in India. And I see these small parties emerging, on the outskirts of what used to be ANC hegemony in South Africa. And I think what Southern authoritarian populism, which has various forms, more or less durable, sometimes, an undercurrent of politics that's working in sort of like undercurrents do. You can't see them, but they're there and they're working their way through the political landscape, changing them little by little, and also more durable regimes and governments like Erdogan in Turkey or Modi in India. Let's not forget, despite the electoral setback.
Yeah.
And precluding a collapse of his coalition, he'll rule for another 5 years. I think what we're seeing there are governing elites formulating political projects that are trying to respond to something very fundamental, which is that the global South in general has seen 3.5 to 4 decades, it differs, of neoliberalization, of economic policies, and more fundamentally accumulation strategies that have concentrated wealth and income with small economic elites. You find this to greater or lesser extents anywhere that you choose to throw a rock. Wherever that rock might land in the global South, you'll find increased inequalities, deepening precarity, labor markets that just don't offer the kind of employment that would underpin a permanent rise from poverty to non-poverty, to prosperity and safety and security. And as a result of that, we have, of course, also across the global South seen tremendous social and political unrest. our memories tend to be very limited. And one of the things that struck me in the 2020s is that we forget that just before we signed off on the 2010s and just before we entered into the nightmare that was COVID, we named the 2010s the decade of the protester. 2019 was the year of the protester, according to Time magazine. Now, you can say a lot about Time magazine, but unlike me, they are not left-wing Marxists, right? And even they acknowledge the significance of popular protests. And that's, of course, pointing to what research shows us, the escalation of political protest in the global south throughout the 2010s. It starts with the Arab uprising of 2011, 2012. And we see it throughout the decade. 2019 rounded off with major political revolts and uprisings in Chile. I was in Lebanon in late 2019 when the uprising was going on there. Huge uprising. And that means that governing elites in the global south right now are presiding over what I would call a legitimation crisis. That the kind of economic policy regimes and the kind of accumulation strategies that have been pursued over the past so many decades have created conditions that undermine the legitimacy of governing elites in the global south, and they have to respond to that. And I think one of their responses is that of authoritarian populism, of what I call Southern authoritarian populism. And not unlike what Thatcher did in the UK with the Conservative Party in the 1980s, is a populism that basically says there's an enemy out there. Which the real, decent, authentic people must be defended against. And in different contexts, the people and their enemy is defined using, different fault lines. So in the Indian context, it's very much religion. So you have the Muslim minority, which is the main other, along with dissenters and, journalists, critics of the government and all of that. If you look to Brazil, it was very much about the criminal, which was always racialized, much like the criminal is in South Africa as well. When we say they come over the wall, the other, we know in our, the figure that's evoked in our heads is racialized, right? And it's the same thing in Brazil, coupled with sexuality. And of course, very conservative gender ideology. So the other is also all of the queer people, trans people, feminists, what have you, that upset a traditional social order. And then you go to the Philippines, and it was the criminal who was typically a drug trafficker. And then you come this side to South Africa, and it's the immigrant. And what all of these projects do is that they deflect discontent onto those groups, and they say, trust in us, trust in the strong man. If we're allowed to discipline those who threaten you, if we're allowed to, govern in a muscular way, we will take you and the nation with us on the path of progress. And that's what authoritarian populism does as a hegemonic project. So it's a project to reconstruct political hegemony in a context with, where there's been massive social and political unrest. And I think, this is, a part of social and political change in the global south that happens at the same time as the world system is changing, at the same time as countries in the global south are rising to the status of emerging powers, the BRICS formation and so on and so forth, at the same time as global hierarchies of wealth are shifting, at the same time as there has been a material expansion in the global south that are shifting ultimately geopolitical parameters in the world system. The fact is that at a national scale, the same processes that have thrown up that scenario that generates the geopolitical shifts of our time have thrown up all of this social and political unrest, which is grounded in precarity and inequality as a result of neoliberal accumulation strategies, which governing elites then have to respond to. And I think they very often respond in a reactionary way through different forms of authoritarian populism that manifests in different ways, in terms of the cultural repertoires and ideas that are mobilized to construct the other and to construct the good, authentic people according to specific national histories.
Cool. And before I go, I think my next question is going to be on the social movements, particularly now that you've touched on protest. I read a statistic at some point in how South Africa had over 100 protests going on a daily basis.
If you look at the work of someone like Kate Alexander from UJ and her colleagues, they coined the term "protest capital of the world" using SAP statistics. And this was famously referring to community protests, as we call them, or I mean, the media would call it service delivery protests. I think that narrows the scope very much in terms of what's going on there. But yeah, I mean, South Africa has been a hub of this, and what I'm talking about is very much manifested here in the 2010s.
Yeah. And what has been the contribution of these social movements? I mean, you've seen the rise Abahlali baseMjondolo here in South Africa, which have been really, really pushing from the protests from below. The Zapatistas, the peasant movements in India. What has been the contributions of these social movements in intervening on democracy and how democracy gets how they feel, how the society feels democracy? What has been their contribution in that?
Okay, let's take one sort of step back, a bit of a meta step back first, and just sort of establish, the centrality of social movements in democracy. And what I normally argue is that without social movements of different kinds, democracy would not have been very democratic at all. And that's true across the north-south axis of the world system. If you look at what we call democracy in its sort of initial formulations, it was, of course, something that benefited a very limited sliver of people everywhere. It was white people, it was men, and it was people of property. So obviously there were also class limitations on who were included in the democratic remit. And the reason for that changing, the reason for that remit expanding, encompassing formerly disenfranchised groups, whether it's working class people or women or in the global north, racial minorities, the fact that the Westphalian state system was expanded to incorporate independent democratic nation states in what we now call the global south in two major waves of decolonization. I'm thinking, obviously of the 19th century wave of decolonization in Latin America and subsequently the post-war phase of decolonization in Asia and Africa. All of that is due to the collective action of social movements. You won't find a white ruling class anywhere sitting around saying, we better give democracy to the masses, of people of color out there because that's the right thing to do. You won't find capitalist elites saying, well, we better concede to some of these reforms to the workers because it's the right thing to do. It's not about accepting something that's morally right. It's about being compelled to change because of being confronted with the challenge of collective action from below. So the way I see it is that the whole history of democracy and of democracy changing, becoming more democratic, encompassing more spheres of society, influencing, to various degrees, the economy, the private sphere even, gender relations and what have you, all of that is due to social movements. And if we move to the present, I think, back in 2014, I wrote this book with a very dear friend and colleague, Lawrence Cox. And it was about, Marxist theory and social movements and the trajectory of neoliberalism. And the book was called We Make Our Own History, and it had a subtitle that used the term The Twilight of Neoliberalism. And what we were trying to point out there is that this rising tide of popular protest in the north and in the south from the second half of the 1990s onwards testifies to the fact that, even though prevailing economic policy regimes remains neoliberal, and I use that term, unashamedly, I still think it's very useful for making sense of the kind of economic policies that have been pursued for the last 3 decades, maybe in 4 decades, and whose interests those policy regimes serve. even though they're still alive and kicking, they're increasingly losing legitimacy. I think the social movements that have erupted in response to that, whether it's Abshlali or the Zapatistas, whether it's community protests, whether it's landless people's movements in Brazil, whether it's farmers' movements or indigenous people's movements in India, all offer, all craft, all generate through their collective action imaginaries of what democracy could be and should be, that expand its remit, that would, if implemented, to put it very simply, deepen democracy in some very, very meaningful ways, and probably also curb some of those mechanisms, those power mechanisms that lead to such deep maldistribution of material resources, both in the North and in the South. And again, I don't think we can have democracy in any meaningful way unless we have social equality, right? Without that, you can take democracy and stick it in your pipe and smoke it because it's uninteresting. But here's the thing. I think we're also at an impasse, at a stalemate, whereby social movements from below are very often incapable of advancing those alternatives in a decisive way, bringing about decisive victories. We have seen a few. So, for example, the farmers' movement in 2020, 2021 in India managed to stop a law that was going to liberalize Indian agriculture further. So you see those kinds of occasional wins. But does it consolidate into a force that can really change the balance of power in society? And the answer there is no. And I think what that takes us to is an overall scenario, which is best grasped in the terms that the Italian Marxist theorist Antonio Gramsci once referred to as an interregnum, which is a very long and drawn-out crisis period. There's a crisis of ideological legitimacy for governing elites. There are a multitude of competing projects trying to take control over, where should society go? And then he writes very decisively that in that particular moment, in that long and protracted crisis, not crisis as a little blip, but a long and protracted crisis, it says the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. And that's where we are now, I think. I think we have seen many vivid, we see many vivid alternatives being, brought into being partly practiced. We must also reckon with the places in which alternatives are, really practiced and so on. But we must also be realistic and I think reckon with the fact that the competition comes from reactionary political projects that push back against these movements and that have, in different national contexts, managed to win support from below, managed to win support from exploited and oppressed groups. That's true of the Modi regime, that's true of Erdogan's regime, that was true of Bolsonaro when he won his election victory going back to 2018, that was true of Duterte. And it's very interesting to see how, in the South African context, you see this, in a small scale, a much smaller scale still, that sort of cross-class almost appeal of the authoritarian populist narrative of law and order, anti-immigration. It also has support among, parts of among social groups who you'd otherwise think of as being on the front lines of progressive social movements. So it's very important to reckon with that and to understand how it might, for those of us who are interested also in progressive politics, which I am, how it might be possible to disrupt those allegiances. The allegiances between, let's just call them broadly, precarious working classes and other subaltern groups, and these reactionary political projects that, link them into a politics which will only continue to deepen precarity whilst channeling forms of exclusion and a very hateful politics towards an imagined enemy out there.
Cool. The question of course, the social movements like Abahlali, for instance, I think dispossession for them, and I think this is almost similar with most of these movements, that dispossession for them is a continuous thing that began democracy did not really intervene on it. So which means it's just been this one continuous thing. And of course, and I think sometimes the reactionary politics sometimes tap into that discontent, that kind of like feeling that there's been like a sustained dispossession even under democratic dispensation.
Precisely.
Does this, and I want you to intervene on this, does it feed into these notions that democracy is an-African? It's, for instance, that it's a Eurocentric concept that emerges outside places like Africa, for instance, because it doesn't intervene. It doesn't really give the break that is imagined. It doesn't bring the emancipatory moment that it imagined to.
Yeah, that's a hugely important question. And when I'm confronted with the idea or the argument that democracy itself is somehow, inherently Eurocentric and therefore limited in its relevance and its impact in Southern contexts, I'm very skeptical of that claim. I think it's partly a dangerous claim and partly an inaccurate claim. I think its problem stems from the fact that we tend to think that ideas and concepts belong in these watertight compartments that just don't communicate with each other and can only be imposed by one compartment upon another. And when that happens, it's a bad fit. Yeah. I say that this is dangerous because we very often see, the argument that democracy, human rights, they're just Western constructs being used by the leaders of reactionary regimes, of authoritarian regimes, of oppressive regimes in the global south that are subject to protest from below by their own citizens, right? So there's a kind of, what should I call it? A reactionary and deeply duplicitous utilization of, decolonial logics to ward off critique of Southern authoritarianism. And that sort of thing only works, only makes sense if we think of the global south in very undifferentiated terms, very often in very state-centric terms. The global south is represented by the states that make up the global south and the governing elites that rule those states. But, it doesn't take much thinking to realize that we must think in a far more disaggregated way, to think about how, that's just one part of the global south. There are civil societies, there are social movements, there are, subaltern groups that aren't effectively represented by these elites, whose interests are actually, not represented at all, not served at all by these governing elites. So that's the first thing. That's why it's dangerous. Yeah. It's dangerous because it deflects criticism, both international and domestic, of authoritarianism. And I think we should stick to a line where authoritarianism is bad, whether it happens in the north or in the south, and regardless of the race of the leader or the regime that's practicing it. I think that's the properly democratic attitude. But it's also inaccurate, right? Because if you think of democracy from its very, very start, the notion of democracy, the notion of rights that come with it, the notion of being a full human that comes with it, has always been contested, right? It's been contested precisely because it was defined in exclusionary ways by elite groups initially. And it's been contested by disenfranchised, exploited and oppressed groups in what we now call the global south from the very get-go. Think of the Haitian Revolution that comes to fruition in 1804 and against slavery and against imperial rule, and that comes up with an idea of what it means to be human, about what it means to have rights, about what democracy entails, that's far more expansive and encompassing than that which was crafted in and through, the bourgeois revolutions across the Atlantic, France, before that England, and subsequently, and what became the United States. So I think it's also, in a sense, saying that democracy is something inherently Western is actually falling for a colonial trope. It's falling for an Orientalist trope where, Western elites, Western philosophers, thinkers, would typically say that, it's only Western white people who are capable of democracy. and proper democratic rule. You know, the hordes out there whom we rule over through our colonial state just can't do that stuff because they're simply not civilized enough.
Yeah.
While the fact of the matter is that the hordes out there were constantly protesting because of the fundamentally undemocratic nature of, you know, Western rule, of enslavement, of colonialism, and thereby making democracy something far more democratic. So there's a sense in which, and that's been going on since the very dawn of political modernity. So there's something that I think that there's an extent to which we shouldn't let the West claim ownership of something that, you know, what we now call the global South, that's been part of shaping from the very beginning, right? Yeah. We shouldn't do that. That's falling for a colonial trope. So those two things are there, first of all. And when it comes to the present, right, I mean, the main frustration about democracy is the same thing that it has always been, in a sense. Its limited capacity to restrain dispossession comes from the fact that democratic transitions, whether from colonial rule, you know, in the middle of the 20th century in India, or from apartheid in South Africa in the middle of the 1990s, and in terms of that transition, limited the ability to, you know, implement properly radical structural reform, redistributing ownership, redistributing resources in society in such a way as to create greater levels of social equality, to put it very simply. And it's not always that those things have to do with imperial power structures, right? Very often, the decisive, you know, the most powerful actors in that are national. You know, if you look at I'm not saying that there's never any imperial interference. Of course, there is. It's still an unequal world system and all the rest of it. But if we don't see the significance of, let's call them, you know, domestic dominant groups, and the ways in which, you know, they have managed to shape democracy in such a way as to proffer up their own advantageous position in society, underpin their own command of resources and wealth and income, then we're doing ourselves a grand disservice by just saying that it's due to something, you know, out there, some sort of imperial power structure out there. It's due to the sort of the conspiratorial machinations of an imagined West, or it's simply US imperialism. It's not that, because we know that the global South is also home to basically stinking rich elites who are also politically very powerful, and who, you know, are as appalled by the notion of deep redistribution towards the majority of society as any northern elites would be. And I think that's what we have to bring into this, rather than sort of assuming that, you know, the limitations of democracy has to do with it sort of, you know, it having inherently Western origins, which in a sense I don't think it has. It has global origins.
Yeah. And then just before we bring this to a close, I want to maybe to intervene on this, because I think what we've discovered is that the post-colonial trajectory has involved in many ways remaking these structures. As a way of rehearsing this post-colonial nation states ideas of law and order, you know, national interest, you know, desirable bodies and undesirable bodies, and of course of dealing with the surplus populations.
Yes.
You know. Can we think beyond race and caste between, in thinking on the futures of democracies? Do you think that these regions, are we at that point of thinking beyond race and caste as a way of thinking the futures of democracy?
Well, there's a certain extent, you know, to a certain extent we must, but it's more than thinking beyond. I think what we should be thinking about is, how do we effectively challenge power structures that are founded you know, on race, that are founded on caste, that are founded on caste, that are also founded on gender in many ways, right? So I'm tempted to say that before we think beyond them, we have to think about how we're going to get beyond them, because they're so very operative in terms of shaping the trajectory of our societies, in terms of shaping how life chances are distributed in society. For me, working as I'm doing now with sort of trying to think comparatively about very basically reactionary right-wing politics in the Global South, authoritarian populism in the Global South, I think, the main question is how can we create attachments to ideas of who the people is, right? Mm-hmm. And create political subjectivities and political identities, a sense of who the people is, who, we, whatever we might mean, are as a people that aren't defined by the kind of exclusions that we see in authoritarian populism, that in a sense accepts that very basic term that nobody's free until everyone's free, rather than the idea that it's the immigrant, it's the Muslim, it's the queer person, it's the criminal, as long as these guys are just disciplined and quite possibly sort of expunged from the nation, will be fine. And that also entails that there's a sense in which a sort of ferocious attachment to the nation can also get in the way there. It's paradoxical in the South African context. I must say that xenophobia has gotten so much hold because what it signifies is a fierce attachment to borders that are colonial constructs, hand-me-downs directly from, settler colonialism, if you will. So why are we so attached to that? Yeah. I think, so those are crucial questions for me. How can we craft a political desire? And I use that term, very deliberately because it's about feeling what we want to be different. Yeah. A political desire for something different than a people that is predicated upon the punitive exclusion of specific groups. That's what we have to work towards, along with foundational changes in social power relations that bring about greater equality. That's when we have democracy. That's real democracy. That's emancipatory democracy. That is democracy that goes far beyond sort of 4-year cycles at the ballot box and the very dry discourse of good governance and what have you. That's where the challenge lies.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Prof, thank you so much. But just before I let you go, your closing remarks on based on these recent elections, particularly because of how these tectonic shifts have been called very good for democracy, that they actually were a victory for democracy in many ways. I mean, we saw these, I think we've discussed, but they've been reduced to that. What would be your reflections on it as a way out?
Honestly, obviously there is a sense in which a challenge to dominant party regimes can always be seen as being good for democracy if we're thinking, about, functioning election procedures and all the rest of it. But whether it will actually be good for democracy is a question that we can only answer in a much longer term when we see how this plays out in terms of what policies are implemented and so on and so forth. I mean, do we think, for example, that the current scenario in South Africa is going to put in place a government that can cut through the sort of that Gordian knot of a political economy that prevents the realization of greater social equality in South Africa? I don't know. I think it would be so. I think that's arguably, leading towards naivety. I want to see, it can't just be that, ANC hegemony has been diminished quite substantially. That's not sufficient in and of itself, certainly not from a sociological point of view. And so, much the same in India. Yes, it's a coalition government, but who is the most decisive factor in that coalition government? So, one thing I've learned from watching, politics in the Global South, in India, in South Africa, elsewhere, is to perhaps be a bit careful and a bit cautious in making very sweeping, very definite statements about what something entails for democracy, because knowing what something entails for democracy also entails adopting a long-term perspective. and looking at how policies play themselves out, if they alter, if you will, the relationships between different groups in society and so on and so forth. So it's very much still an open question. And I don't think we can say that things are, good for democracy simply because we see that procedures work. We have to look at the substantive content of the politics that comes to define societal development in the longer term before we say something very definite about that.
Well, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you so much for joining. Remember to like, to share, and to subscribe. Thank you.